I work at a telephone booth in Colorado. There are strange rules to follow. Imagine taking a simple night shift job, just sitting in an old telephone booth on an empty highway. No calls to make, no one around, just you and the silence. But then, the rules come in. Do not answer the phone. Do not look outside if you hear knocking. Do not acknowledge anything that tries to get your attention. Seems easy, right? Until the phone starts ringing. Until the whispers begin. Until you realize you are not alone. What happens when someone breaks the rules? What happens when the booth isn't just a booth, but a seal? And what happens when the door is finally opened? You're about to find out. Subscribe to Mr. Quentin for more terrifying real-life stories and unexplained mysteries. Hit that bell icon, because some secrets should never be forgotten. Ethan pulled his coat tighter against the cold, the faded denim offering little protection from the biting evening wind. He sat in a run-down diner on the outskirts of town, a half-empty cup of coffee growing cold in front of him as he flipped through the crinkled pages of the Creek Courier, his stomach twisted with anxiety. He needed work, badly. The mines had shut down, and with them went his only source of income. Options were running out. Then an ad caught his eye. Night guard wanted, remote location, must be comfortable with solitude, strict protocol, excellent pay, inquire within, ask for Silas. The wording was strange, almost ominous in its simplicity. No business name, no real details, just a cryptic message and an address on the far edge of town. Ethan hesitated. Everything about this screamed bad idea, but desperation had a way of dulling instincts. His rent was overdue, his truck needed repairs. Whatever this job was, he needed it. Sighing, he folded the paper, stuffed it into his jacket pocket, and threw a few bills onto the counter before heading for the door. The address led him to a narrow brick building nestled between two abandoned storefronts. A faded wooden sign above the entrance read, Silas Antiquities and Curios. The display window was cluttered with eerie objects, porcelain dolls with cracked faces, tarnished pocket watches, old photographs of people whose expressions seemed too still. A strange unease settled over Ethan's shoulders, but he shook it off and pushed open the door. A bell jingled as he stepped inside. The shop smelled of dust and age, of forgotten things. Shelves lined the walls packed with oddities, leather-bound books in languages he didn't recognize, glass jars filled with murky liquids, taxidermy animals staring lifelessly from behind glass domes. A man appeared from the back room. He was tall and painfully thin, his features sharp enough to cut. His dark suit was impeccable, contrasting with the dust that coated nearly everything else in the store. His deep-set eyes locked onto Ethan with unsettling intensity. "You're here about the job," the man said. It wasn't a question. Ethan hesitated before nodding. "Yeah." The ad said to ask for Silas. The man gave a small, tight-lipped smile. "Then you've come to the right place." He gestured for Ethan to follow him deeper into the shop, into a dimly lit office lined with more strange artifacts. Silas took a seat behind an old mahogany desk, fingers steepled in front of him. "The job is simple," he said. "You will guard a telephone booth on Whisper Pass, midnight to dawn. You do not leave the booth under any circumstances. You do not answer the phone if it rings. You do not acknowledge anything outside the booth, no matter what you hear." Ethan frowned. "That's it?" "That's it." He slid a slip of paper across the desk. Ethan's breath hitched when he saw the amount, more than he had made in a month at the mine. "What's the catch?" Silas's smile didn't waver. "There is no catch. Just follow the rules, and you'll be fine." Something in his tone made Ethan's skin crawl, but money was money. "All right," he said finally. "I'll do it." Silas nodded. "Good." Whisper Pass was nothing more than a forgotten stretch of road winding through the wilderness, the mountains standing like silent sentinels beneath a pale moon. Ethan had never been this far out before, As he followed the directions Silas had given him, he felt the weight of absolute solitude settle over him. Then he saw it. A lone telephone booth stood beside the road, illuminated by a single flickering street lamp. The booth was old, the glass scratched and smudged, the red paint peeling from the frame. A wooden stool sat inside, along with a clipboard. Ethan parked his truck a few feet away, grabbed his thermos of coffee, and stepped inside the booth. He flipped through the clipboard. The last recorded shift had been weeks ago. He settled onto the stool and waited. For the first hour, nothing happened. Then, just past 1 o'clock, the phone rang. The sharp, shrill sound made him jolt. His pulse quickened as he stared at the rotary phone. "Do not answer the phone." Silas's words echoed in his mind. The ringing continued, loud, insistent. A part of him itched to pick up. Maybe it was Silas checking in. Maybe this was some kind of test. But something deep inside him whispered, "Don't." The ringing stopped. A heavy silence followed. Then, a whisper. Soft, indistinct, just outside the booth. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The whispering grew louder, shifting into something that almost sounded like words, but not quite. A language he didn't understand. Then, something knocked on the glass. A slow, deliberate tap. Ethan squeezed his hands into fists. Do not acknowledge anything outside the booth. His heart pounded. Another knock. Then another. Then silence. That evening, Ethan returned to Silas's shop. The bell jingled as he stepped inside, and Silas was already waiting for him, as if he had known exactly when Ethan would arrive. "How was your first night?" he asked. Ethan swallowed. The phone rang. Silas nodded. "Did you answer it?" "No." Silas's expression remained unreadable. "Good." Ethan licked his lips. Something knocked. For the first time, Silas's smile faltered, just slightly. "Did you look?" Ethan shook his head. Silas studied him for a long moment before finally opening a drawer and pulling out an envelope. "Your payment." Ethan took it. The weight of it was reassuring, but he hesitated. "What happens if I do look?" Silas's smile returned, colder this time. "You wouldn't be here to ask." Ethan sat stiffly in the dimly lit office of Silas's Antiquities and Curios, his fingers gripping the armrests of the worn leather chair. The air was thick with the scent of old books, wood polish, and something faintly metallic. Across from him, Silas slid a small, weathered leather notebook across the desk. Its cover was smooth with age, the corners curling slightly. "These," Silas said, tapping the notebook, "are the rules. Read them carefully. Follow them exactly." Ethan hesitated before flipping it open. The pages were filled with tight, elegant handwriting, ink slightly smudged with time. His pulse quickened as he read. "Rules for the night guard at Whisper Pass shift begins at 11 p.m. and ends at 5 a.m. Arrive on time. Leave on time. No exceptions. Do not bring personal items. The booth will have everything you need. A thermos of coffee, a flashlight, a radio, preset to static, and this notebook. If the phone rings, do not answer. If it rings more than 3 times in an hour, log the occurrence in the notebook. If there is knocking on the glass, do not acknowledge it. If it lasts more than a minute, put on the provided headphones and wait. Do not remove them until the knocking stops. If you see anything unusual outside, do not react. Do not make eye contact. Do not turn your head toward it. Simply record the time and description in the logbook. If the radio stops emitting static, turn it off immediately. Do not attempt to retune it. Do not listen to anything it may broadcast." Ethan exhaled sharply, his grip tightening on the edges of the notebook. This is some kind of joke, right?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Silas's expression remained unreadable. "It's not." Ethan stared at the list again. The words carried a quiet weight, a sense of something old and unshakable. The instructions weren't just weird, they were precise, as if they had been written by someone who had learned the rules the hard way. "The pay is high for a reason," Silas continued, pulling open a drawer and retrieving a tarnished brass key. "If you follow the rules, you'll be fine. If you don't—" He paused, tapping a single long finger against the desk. "Well, just follow them." Ethan swallowed hard. His gut screamed at him to walk away, but his bank account told him otherwise. He reached out and took the key. "I'll be there at 11. Silas smiled thinly. "Good." Ethan's truck rumbled to a stop beside the lone telephone booth on Whisper Pass. The road was empty, stretching into darkness in both directions. The surrounding wilderness was suffocatingly silent. No wind, no crickets, not even the rustling of tree branches. He exhaled, staring at the booth. The dim glow of the flickering street lamp cast long, jagged shadows. The glass of the booth was scratched and smudged, and inside, a wooden stool sat beside a small shelf holding the radio, flashlight, thermos, and notebook. Ethan glanced at the clock on his dashboard. 10:58 p.m. He grabbed the notebook and key before stepping out. The air was colder here, sharp and biting. As he unlocked the booth and stepped inside, the door creaked shut behind him with unsettling finality. He settled onto the stool, set the notebook on his lap, and switched on the radio. Static filled the air, low, constant, oddly comforting. He sipped the provided coffee, its bitterness grounding him. For the first hour, nothing happened. Then, at 12:17 a.m., the phone rang. Ethan's stomach clenched as the sharp sound cut through the night. He stared at the rotary phone, its brass dial gleaming under the dim light. "Do not answer." The ringing continued, 3 times. Then silence. He exhaled shakily, flipping open the notebook to log it. 12:17 a.m. Phone rang 3 times. The booth remained still. The road was empty. Then, at 1:42 a.m., the knocking started. Soft at first, a gentle rhythmic tap against the glass. Ethan froze. His grip on the pen tightened. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Do not acknowledge it. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate. 1 knock, pause, 2 knocks, pause, 3. It didn't stop. The rule had been clear. If it lasted more than a minute, he had to put on the headphones. Ethan reached for them with shaking hands, slipping them over his ears. The padded muffs muffled the sound, though he swore he could still feel the vibrations against the glass. His pulse pounded as he stared straight ahead, refusing to move. Then, after what felt like an eternity, silence. Ethan exhaled, his breath shuddering. He slowly removed the headphones. The booth was quiet. The road was empty. He recorded the incident in the log. 1:42 a.m. Knocking lasted over a minute. Used headphones. It stopped. The rest of the night passed in uneasy stillness. He counted down the minutes until dawn, every muscle in his body tense. When 5 a.m. arrived, the street lamp flickered out, as if signaling his shift's end. Ethan grabbed the notebook, stepped out of the booth, and locked the door behind him. His legs were unsteady as he walked back to his truck. He didn't look back as he drove away. Silas was waiting for him. Ethan stepped inside the antique shop, the bell above the door jingling softly. His hands trembled slightly as he set the notebook down on the counter. "How was it?" Silas asked, his tone unreadable. Ethan let out a breath. "The phone rang 3 times. Silas nodded. "Did you answer it?" "No." "Good." Ethan hesitated. Something knocked. It wouldn't stop. "I used the headphones." For the first time, Silas's expression shifted, just slightly. Not surprise, not concern, something else. "Did you look?" Ethan shook his head. "No." A slow smile spread across Silas's face. "Then you did well." He reached into a drawer, pulling out a thick envelope. Ethan took it, the weight of the cash inside more reassuring than it should have been. As he turned to leave, he hesitated at the door. What happens if I do look? Silas regarded him for a long moment before speaking, voice smooth as ever. You won't have to worry about coming back. The answer settled into Ethan's bones like ice. He nodded once and left. As he stepped out into the rising dawn, he told himself he wouldn't return for another shift. But as he counted the money in his truck, his fingers trembling over the crisp bills, he knew he was lying to himself. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter as his truck rumbled down Whisper Pass. The cracked asphalt stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by looming, mist-draped mountains that seemed to close in the farther he drove. The headlights barely cut through the thick fog clinging to the road, swallowing the landscape in a muffled silence. The only sound inside the truck was the static from the radio. No music, no voices, just a ceaseless low crackle like distant whispers. He had tried tuning to another station, but every channel was the same. It felt wrong. A deep unease settled in his chest. He turned the radio off. The silence that followed wasn't any better. Then, up ahead, he saw it. A lone telephone booth stood beside the road, illuminated by a flickering street lamp that buzzed weakly against the night. The booth was old, its red paint peeling, the glass panels clouded with grime and streaked with scratches. One of the panes was cracked, a thin fracture running from the bottom corner to the center. Ethan slowed to a stop and cut the engine. The stillness out here was suffocating. No wind, no crickets, just nothing. Taking a steadying breath, he grabbed the small leather notebook Silas had given him, along with the tarnished brass key, and stepped out of the truck. The booth smelled strange, dust like an old attic, ozone like the air before a thunderstorm, and something else, faint but distinct, like metal left out in the rain. Inside, the setup was just as Silas had promised. A small wooden stool, a radio, preset to static, a flashlight with fresh batteries, and strangely, a steaming thermos of coffee. Ethan frowned. The coffee smelled fresh, rich, and warm, as if someone had just poured it, but that was impossible. Ignoring the unease curling in his stomach, he settled onto the stool and placed the notebook on his lap. His fingers brushed against the embossed cover, the aged leather cool against his skin. He flipped to a blank page and checked his watch. 11:07 p.m. Nothing to do now but wait. The night stretched on in eerie silence. Ethan sipped the coffee, hot, strong, too fresh, and listened to the steady hum of static from the radio. He had expected the solitude to be boring, maybe even peaceful. It wasn't. Something about this place was wrong. The darkness beyond the street lamp's glow felt too deep, too heavy. The mist curling around the mountains seemed to move in a way mist shouldn't. Too slow, too deliberate. And every so often, he thought he heard something out in the distance. A rustling, a breath. He told himself it was just the wind. Even though there was no wind, he checked his watch. 12:16 a.m. Nothing had happened yet. Maybe this would be easier than he thought. Then, at 12:17 a.m., the phone rang. Ethan jolted, nearly spilling the coffee in his hand. The old rotary phone sat on a metal shelf beside him, the brass dial gleaming under the dim booth light. The bell inside it clanged, loud and jarring against the quiet. He stared at it. "Do not answer the phone." Silas's words echoed in his mind. The ringing continued. Once, twice, a third time, then silence. Ethan exhaled slowly, his pulse hammering. He grabbed the notebook and wrote, 12:17 a.m. Phone rang 3 times, did not answer. For several minutes, he sat frozen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. The static on the radio remained unchanged. The night outside stayed still. Maybe it was a test. Maybe Silas had called to see if he would follow the rules. Shaking off the lingering unease, he forced himself to relax, rubbing his hands together for warmth, but the air inside the booth had grown colder, subtly but noticeably. The glass fogged slightly with his breath. He tried to ignore it. At 1:42 a.m., it started. A knock, software light. A single tap against the glass, just behind him. Ethan's blood ran cold. Do not acknowledge it. He gripped the edge of the stool, staring straight ahead, heart pounding so hard he swore he could hear it. Another knock, 2 taps this time. It was slow, deliberate, as if it knew he could hear it. Do not turn around. The mist outside the booth had thickened, pressing against the glass like a living thing. The street lamp flickered, casting shifting shadows. Then, a third knock. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay still. The notebook. Write it down. His fingers trembled as he jotted in the log. 1:42 a.m. Knocking. 3 taps. Not looking. The knocking didn't stop. It grew closer. Slow, insistent, a finger dragging across the glass. His breath caught. The rule. If the knocking lasts more than a minute, put on the headphones. Fumbling, he grabbed the padded headphones from the shelf and slipped them on. Instantly, silence. The knocking vanished, but he could still feel it. A presence, close, watching, minutes stretched like hours. Then, finally, it was gone. Ethan didn't move again until the first pale streaks of dawn crept over the mountains. At 5 a.m. sharp, the street lamp flickered out. The mist began to thin. With shaking hands, he removed the headphones, half expecting to still hear the knocking. Silence. Slowly, he stood, legs stiff from hours of tension. He grabbed the notebook, his flashlight, and the empty thermos, then stepped outside. The air was crisp, normal. The booth stood quiet, just an old, forgotten thing on an empty road. Ethan locked the door behind him. He didn't look at the glass, didn't check for smudges, didn't want to know if there was anything on the other side. As he climbed into his truck, his hands were still shaking. Silas was waiting when Ethan entered the shop later that morning. Without a word, he slid the notebook onto the counter. Silas flipped through the pages, scanning the notes. His expression didn't change until he reached the knocking. He paused, looked up. "You handled it well," he said finally. Ethan exhaled, rubbing his face. "What happens if I don't?" Silas closed the notebook. "You don't get a second chance." The words settled into Ethan's bones. Silas reached into the drawer and handed him an envelope. Thick, heavy. Ethan hesitated before taking it. The money felt tainted. He should walk away. Never return, but his rent was due. His truck needed repairs, and the pay was just too good. "Same time tomorrow?" he heard himself ask. Silas smiled. "Of course." Ethan nodded, turned, and left. The bell over the door jingled, and behind him, Silas's smile never wavered. The shrill ringing of the telephone shattered the heavy silence inside the booth. Ethan's breath hitched. He sat frozen on the stool, fingers tightening around the notebook in his lap. His eyes flicked to the old rotary phone on the shelf beside him. The brass dial gleamed under the flickering street lamp, and the handset vibrated slightly with each sharp, jarring ring. His mind raced. The rules. Do not answer the phone. The ringing cut through the night. Once, twice, a third time. Then silence. Ethan exhaled slowly, releasing the tension from his shoulders. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. He grabbed his pen, flipping open the notebook with stiff fingers. 12:17 a.m. Phone rang 3 times. Did not answer. He stared at the entry for a long moment before setting the notebook aside. The night remained still. The mist outside the booth pressed against the glass, thick and unmoving. His reflection stared back at him, distorted by the grime and the cracked panel beside the door. Then something moved behind him. A shadow. Ethan's stomach clenched. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't his imagination. The dark figure drifted through the mist. pacing in slow, unnatural circles around the booth. It didn't walk. It glided. Its shape was human-like, but wrong. Too tall, too thin. Its movements jerky, as if it existed between frames of reality, appearing in one position, then another, with no natural transition in between. Ethan kept his breathing steady, his hands locked on his knees. Do not acknowledge anything outside the booth. His vision tunneled, locking onto the radio dial. The static hummed in the background, a low, steady hiss. The shadow moved closer. It lingered. Its shape hovered just beyond the glass, shifting like smoke, dark but undefined. He could see it reflected faintly in the glass panel. A jagged outline, a suggestion of something more. Then it did something worse. It turned toward him. His pulse spiked. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself not to look. Do not make eye contact. The air inside the booth grew colder. His breath misted in front of him. Then came the knocking. Soft, at first. A single, delicate tap against the glass behind him. Then another. Then harder, rhythmic, unrelenting. Ethan clenched his fists. His gut twisted violently, every nerve screaming at him to run. The knocking grew louder, pounding. The glass trembled under the force of it. Something wanted in. Ethan forced his eyes to the notebook. Follow the rules. The rule. If the knocking lasts more than a minute, put on the headphones. With shaking hands, he reached for the padded headphones on the shelf. The knocking was relentless now, rattling the booth, making the cracked glass groan under the pressure. He yanked the headphones over his ears. The sound of the knocking vanished. For a moment, there was blissful silence. Then, a voice. Cold. Whispering. Right inside his ears. Let us in. Ethan's stomach turned to ice. The whisper was low, crawling beneath his skin like something slithering through his veins. It wasn't just a voice. It was voices, layered, wrong. We are hungry. His fingers dug into the arms of the stool. The whispering slithered through the static, curling around him like a living thing. You can open the door, you know. It's so cold out here. You don't have to be alone. Ethan shut his eyes. The voices laughed. It was an awful sound, low, distorted, stretched too thin like something that didn't belong in this world. His breathing came in sharp, panicked gasps. His hands were slick with sweat. We see you. We know you hear us. The temperature plummeted. His skin prickled, ice forming along the metal edges of the telephone. Then, the static on the radio cut out. His eyes flew open. The rule: if the radio stops emitting static, turn it off immediately. He lunged forward, slamming his hand on the radio's knob, twisting it off. The whispers stopped. Silence crashed down like a heavy weight. For a moment, Ethan sat there, panting, his heart hammering against his ribs. Slowly, too slowly, the air inside the booth began to warm again. The frost melted. His breath no longer misted in the air. The knocking had stopped. He waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. Finally, hands still trembling, he pulled off the headphones. The world outside was still shrouded in thick mist, the street lamp flickering weakly above him. The figure was gone. Ethan exhaled shakily. His hands were unsteady as he picked up the notebook and logged the event. 1:42 a.m. Knocking lasted over a minute. Put on headphones. Heard whispering. The radio stopped emitting static. Shut it off. Whispering ceased. He stared at the words, rereading them over and over. This wasn't just a job. There was something here, something real. He wasn't alone on Whisper Pass, and whatever they were waiting. Ethan remained on edge for the rest of the shift. Every tick of the second hand on his watch felt too slow. When 5 a.m. arrived, the street lamp flickered out, as if signaling his release. He wasted no time. He grabbed the notebook, pulled the key from his pocket, and stepped out of the booth. The moment he did, the night felt normal again. He turned. The glass was different, Smudged. Handprints. Small, elongated handprints trailing down the panels. Too many fingers. Too long. Ethan locked the booth without looking too closely. He climbed into his truck and started the engine with shaky hands. As he pulled away, he glanced once in the rearview mirror. The booth stood alone. Empty. Normal. But deep down he knew. They were still there. Waiting. And for reasons he didn't understand, he knew he would be coming back. Ethan's breath came in ragged, uneven bursts. His hands trembled as he ripped off the headphones, his heartbeat slamming against his ribs. The booth was silent. The knocking had stopped. He swallowed hard, blinking against the sweat stinging his eyes. The figure outside was gone. The thick mist pressing against the glass had shifted, leaving only the road beyond, stretching empty and endless into the darkness. For a fleeting moment, relief settled in his chest. Then, the phone rang. Ethan flinched. His pulse spiked again. The old rotary phone sat on its metal shelf, the handset vibrating slightly with each shrill ring. The brass dial gleamed under the dim glow of the flickering street lamp. Do not answer the phone. The rule burned in his mind. He had followed it before. He had resisted. But this time, something was different. His hand moved on its own. Number. His fingers reached out, gripping the receiver before his mind could process what he was doing. The cold plastic sent a jolt through his skin, as if something else had been waiting for him to pick it up. A moment of stillness. Then, he lifted the receiver to his ear. The silence on the other end was wrong. Too deep, too empty. Like the space between stars. Then a voice. Flat. Monotone. Wrong. You should not have answered. Ethan's breath hitched. His grip on the phone tightened. He tried to respond, to force words past his tightening throat, but his voice came out weak. A whisper. Who is this? The line crackled. Then, the voice spoke again. You have broken the rules. A low hum filled the receiver. A vibration that sank beneath his skin, curling deep in his bones. You have opened the door. The air in the booth shifted. The temperature plummeted. The frost on the glass returned instantly, spreading in intricate patterns across the surface. His breath came out in thick, shuddering clouds. Then, movement. Ethan's eyes darted to the glass. His reflection had changed. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a distortion in the cracked panel beside him. But then, he saw it. Something was standing behind him, a shape, pale, tall, too thin. His stomach clenched violently. He didn't want to look. He needed to put the phone down. But he was frozen. The thing behind him shifted. Its elongated frame loomed in the reflection, shoulders hunched unnaturally, its skin stretched too tight over its bones. Its arms were too long, its fingers, too many, drummed lightly against the inside of the glass. The reflection's head tilted, a sickening, unnatural motion, like a marionette with its strings suddenly cut. Then it smiled. The grin stretched impossibly wide. Needle-like teeth gleamed beneath its cracked lips. Ethan's vision tunneled, his entire body locked into place, his breath shallow, his pulse roaring in his ears. He needed to move. He needed to run. But his limbs wouldn't obey. The air in the booth grew heavy, like the weight of the ocean pressing down, crushing, suffocating. Then it moved. Slowly. So slowly. The thing in the reflection lifted a hand, and it touched his shoulder. A bolt of ice shot through Ethan's body. His skin prickled violently, the sensation wrong, like cold metal pressed against exposed nerves. The fingers tightened. A whisper crawled into his ear, slithering through the phone line, wrapping around his thoughts like barbed wire. Now, you are ours. Ethan tried to scream, tried to jerk away, tried to do anything, but then everything went dark. When Ethan's eyes snapped open, he was no longer in the telephone booth. At first, He wasn't sure if he was anywhere at all. The world around him was black, a deep inky void stretching forever. No sky, no ground, just nothingness. A distant sound echoed through the space, soft knocking. His heart clenched. His breath came in ragged bursts, cold and sharp. He tried to move, but his body felt unreal, like he wasn't fully in it. Then, a light. A single flickering glow in the distance. Not a sun, not a star, a street lamp, and beneath it, the telephone booth. It stood in the endless dark, exactly as it had before. The cracked glass, the peeling paint, the old rotary phone resting silently on its shelf. But something was different. Something was inside. A shadow sat on the wooden stool, head bowed, fingers drumming idly against the metal frame of the phone, waiting. Ethan's stomach twisted as the figure inside lifted its head. It was him. His own face stared back through the glass, his own eyes, but empty. Black voids where pupils should have been. A slow, knowing smile stretched across his reflection's face. The phone inside the booth began to ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Ethan stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go, just endless dark. The ringing stopped. His reflection lifted the receiver. Ethan felt something heavy settle in his chest, pressing down on his ribs like hands reaching through his skin. Then his own voice, flat, monotone, wrong, spoke from the booth. Ethan tried to scream. The darkness swallowed him whole. The morning sun barely touched Whisper Pass. The mist still clung to the mountains, curling around the cracked highway like ghostly fingers. It was always like this after a disappearance, cold, too quiet, as if the world itself held its breath. Sarah pulled her truck to a stop a few feet from the telephone booth. She killed the engine, but she didn't move immediately. Instead, she sat there, fingers gripping the steering wheel, staring at the booth through the windshield. She already knew what she would find. She had been doing this for years. Stepping out, she adjusted the strap of her leather satchel and approached. The booth stood as it always did, alone, forgotten, waiting. But the signs were there. Something had happened. The door hung slightly open. A gust of wind stirred the silence, pushing it inward just a fraction. Sarah exhaled slowly, bracing herself, then stepped inside. The air inside the booth was cold, too cold. The glass panels were fogged over, streaked with something not quite condensation. She spotted the first sign of trouble immediately. Spilled coffee. A dark stain marred the wooden stool, a paper cup lying on its side on the floor. The liquid had already seeped into the cracks, leaving a warped, swollen stain. Beside it, a broken flashlight. The casing was cracked, the batteries missing, as if someone had gripped it too hard before dropping it. Her eyes moved to the headphones. They lay tangled in a heap, the cord wrapped around itself in a way that didn't seem accidental, like they had been ripped off in a hurry. And then, the phone. The receiver dangled from the metal cord, swaying slightly, even though there was no wind inside the booth. A faint, persistent hum crackled from the speaker. Not static, not entirely. It was layered, something buried beneath the white noise, something Sarah didn't want to decipher. Her stomach turned. She knew what had happened. She had known from the moment she arrived. Another night guard was gone. Sarah sighed and pulled out her leather-bound notebook. She had been keeping records of these disappearances for years, long before Silas ever knew. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the last piece of the puzzle, the night guard's logbook. It sat neatly beside the radio, untouched except for one final entry. She flipped it open, scanning the dates. The pages were filled with neat, careful handwriting, the logs of an obedient worker following the rules, until the last page. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she read the final words, scrawled in uneven, hurried strokes. 12:17 a.m., 3 rings. Her throat tightened. Liam was gone. Sarah ran her fingers over the ink, her mind racing. She had checked on dozens of night guards. Some lasted longer than others. Some made it through a week, a few through a month, but most disappeared. And every single time, she would come here in the morning to find the same thing: spilled coffee, broken equipment, the receiver hanging off the hook, and the logbook. Always, the last entry was about the phone. She pressed her lips together, a flicker of something sharp and hot burning in her chest. Anger? Frustration? This wasn't an accident. It never had been. Silas knew. He always knew. And yet, the job posting always reappeared. The ad would go out in the Creek Courier, a new desperate soul would come knocking, and the cycle would start again. Sarah clenched her fists. She had spent years following orders, reporting to Silas, pretending she didn't know. But she did. And she was tired of the secrecy. She glanced back at the phone, its receiver still swaying slightly, as if something had just let go of it. For a long moment, she considered picking it up. Would she hear them? Would she hear Liam? The thought sent a cold shudder down her spine. Number not yet. She wasn't ready for that. Instead, she carefully placed the logbook into her satchel, secured it tight, and turned on her heel. A different path. Sarah didn't drive back to Silas's shop. Not this time. Instead, she turned in the opposite direction, heading straight for home. If Silas suspected anything, she didn't care. She wasn't going to let another name disappear into a logbook. This time, she was going to find out the truth. And when she did, she would make sure no one else ever had to take the job again. Sarah barely registered the sound of her apartment door clicking shut behind her. She moved on autopilot, dropping her satchel onto the cluttered desk near the window. The dim light of a flickering street lamp outside cast long, shifting shadows across the room, but she didn't notice. Her mind was somewhere else. She emptied her bag, spreading its contents across the desk: Liam's logbook, her own old records, yellowed newspaper clippings, and the leather notebook of rules. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, each entry a grim reminder of how many had come before Liam, and how many had never come back. She ran a hand through her hair, exhaling shakily. This wasn't just a pattern. This was a cycle, a carefully maintained ritual, and Liam had broken it. She needed to understand why. She reached for an old, brittle newspaper clipping, the edges curling with age. It was from the Creek Courier, dated 1952. The headline read, "Local businessman Elias Thorne oversees construction of Highway Addition, a new era for Whisper Pass." Sarah's pulse quickened. She had seen the name before: Elias Thorne, Silas's grandfather. She scanned the article, her eyes darting over the printed words. Thorne has insisted on a structural addition at an unusual location, a telephone booth, to be built at the midpoint of the new stretch of highway. When asked why such an isolated spot was chosen, Thorne responded, "Some places need to remain watched. Some doors need to stay closed." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The booth was never just a booth. She dug deeper, pulling out family records, old land surveys, anything she could find. And then, there it was, a letter, yellowed with time, dated 1953, a private correspondence between Elias Thorne and an unnamed recipient. The convergence point is active again. The structure is in place. The barrier should hold as long as the rules are followed. If no one listens, then God help them. God help us all. Sarah sat back, her mind spinning. Her fingers traced the ink, smudged from decades of neglect. The booth wasn't a forgotten relic. It was a containment device, a seal, a barrier, and now the barrier was broken. Sarah pulled the leather notebook of rules closer, flipping through its pages with renewed urgency. Every instruction, every rule, felt like a ritual. She grabbed a separate sheet of paper and started mapping something out, copying the symbols and notations she had seen in the margins. They weren't random. They were coordinates. Her hands moved quickly, sketching a rough outline over an old map of Whisper Pass. She followed the locations, tracing them with the tip of her pen. Her breath hitched. They formed a circle. And at the center of that circle? The telephone booth. Sarah's hand trembled. This wasn't just superstition. It wasn't just a haunted road. The booth was built with intention, a seal to trap something inside. And Liam had answered the phone. His final act had broken the cycle. The door was open. Sarah's mind raced. She thought back to the knocking, the whispers, the figures outside the glass. They hadn't just been tormenting the night guards. They had been testing the seal. And now, the rules had been broken. Sarah stared down at the map, pulse hammering. If the booth was truly a containment device, and it had been broken, then whatever had been trapped inside was no longer contained. Her fingers curled around the edge of the desk. Had Silas known? Had he known all this time that the job he posted in the Creek Courier wasn't just about monitoring the booth, but maintaining the lock? Had he sent those desperate workers time after time just to keep it sealed? And now the barrier was gone. She swallowed hard. Outside, the street lamp flickered. The static hum of the city at night pressed against the glass of her window. Then she noticed something. The phone in her apartment, an old rotary model inherited from her grandfather, was off the hook. Her stomach twisted. She didn't remember leaving it like that. The receiver dangled, swaying slightly, just like the one in the booth, and from the speaker, faint but unmistakable. A whisper, not static, not an electrical hum. A voice, waiting. Sarah's breath caught. She reached for the phone, heart hammering. Her fingers hovered over the receiver. She could end this now. She could listen. She could know. But deep down, she already understood. The rules had been broken, and now there was no one left to hold the door closed. Slowly, Sarah stepped back. She didn't pick up the phone. Instead, she grabbed her jacket, her keys, and the notebook of rules. She had one last stop to make. She was going back to Silas, and this time, she wasn't leaving without answers. The bell above the antique shop door let out a shrill jingle as Sarah shoved it open, the old wood creaking under her force. The shop smelled of dust, aged paper, and something metallic beneath it all. Something wrong. Silas was already waiting. He stood behind the cluttered counter, his fingers lightly resting on an open ledger, as if he had been expecting her. His deep-set eyes met hers without surprise, but there was something different this time. A weight. Sarah threw Liam's logbook onto the counter, her hands shaking. "He's gone," she said, voice tight with fury. Silas exhaled through his nose, glancing down at the logbook, then back at her. He didn't ask who she meant. He already knew. It was bound to happen eventually. His voice was calm, too calm. Sarah's anger flared. You knew what that booth was from the beginning, and you sent them anyway." Silas didn't deny it. Instead, he reached under the counter, retrieving an old leather-bound book, different from the one he had given Liam. This one was older, worn. Pages yellowed with time, corners curling like something ancient and alive. He set it between them and opened it to a specific page, a sketch of the telephone booth, but it wasn't just a booth. Symbols surrounded it, forming a circle, the same pattern Sarah had discovered in the logbook's margins, markings for containment, for sealing. Sarah's stomach twisted. It was never just a phone booth, Silas said, voice low, measured. It was a lock. Sarah swallowed. She had already known that much. But there was something he hadn't told her. Then tell me what it was locking away. Silas hesitated, fingers tracing the faded ink on the page. His face, always so unreadable, seemed almost tired. The rules weren't just for the night guards, he said. They were part of the ritual. The cycle had to be followed. The calls, the knocking, the figures outside, every step was designed to hold them back. Sarah's breath hitched. Them? Silas closed the book with a soft thud. They are the ones who wait, he said quietly, the ones who hunger. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She thought about Liam, his logbook entry, 12:17 a.m. 3 rings, and then the broken rule. By answering the phone, he had let them in. Sarah took a step back. The air in the shop felt different now, like the world had shifted just slightly out of place, and outside. The wind was picking up. Not normal wind, something else. A low, steady hum of whispers curled through the cracks of the shop door. Not loud, not urgent, but present. Listening. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. We have to fix it. Silas shook his head. It's too late. No. Her voice hardened. We fix it. We rebuild the seal. We close the door. Silas's expression darkened. The seal is already broken, and it's spreading. Sarah opened her mouth to argue, but then, in the distance, she heard it. Not one phone, not just the booth. Hundreds of phones, ringing, a chorus of sharp, piercing shrieks echoing through the streets. Sarah's pulse spiked. She turned toward the window, heart hammering. The street outside had been empty when she arrived. But now, the payphones on the corners, every single one was ringing. Lights in apartment buildings flickered on as landlines screamed into the night. Inside the shop, an old rotary phone on the counter vibrated against the wood, its receiver rattling like something was trying to break free from the line. Sarah's stomach twisted. This wasn't just whisper pass anymore. This was everywhere. A final sound cut through the ringing, threading itself directly into her mind. A whisper. You were warned. The bell above the shop door jingled. Slowly, painfully slowly, Sarah turned. A dark figure stood in the doorway. Not Silas, not human, tall, thin. Skin stretched too tight over jagged bones, black, empty eyes locked onto hers, and then it smiled, rows of needle-like teeth, waiting. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. No time to run, no time to scream. She had one thought before the darkness took her. Liam had only been the beginning.